Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Filmnut. I am your host, Jeff Schubert. Glad you can join us. Well, typically when we think of editor and post-production, we think of an editor as someone that does everything, but actually it's pretty specialized and it's pretty broken down. The editor, specifically on a normal budget type of film, would be the person that organizes the order of the images or the picture. What about sound? Who does that? The sound editor. And there's special effects, visual effects, all kinds of different specialties. Today, we're going to focus on the person that corrects the color correction, a colorist, if you will. Because yeah, someone's got to make those reds redder, blues bluer. What if it's overexposed, underexposed, too dark, too light? Lots of different things that the colorist can do to help the final look of the picture. And as my guest Charles Haine will later explain, you can even involve them early on in the pre-production process to help you there too. Not something you might normally think of someone including in your pre-production crew, but definitely I will let him get to that. So speaking of my guest today, Charles Haine, he is co-founder of Dirty Robber, an editing and coloring facility in Los Angeles, California. In addition to post-production, Charles is an instructor for advanced cinematography at Los Angeles City College and is an instructor in advanced cinematography and color grading at Columbia College in Hollywood. This fall, he's going to be teaching a course in stereoscopic cinematography, and he is also a graduate of USC's MFA program and has Indie credits as a director and a cinematographer. A great background, but today we're going to focus on color correction with Charles Haine. Charles.
Hi.
How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
Thanks for coming on, and first and foremost, let me thank you again for coloring my most recent project, the sex tape. Did a great job, and I'm happy to have you on to talk about color work in general.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure working with you, and I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Now, the first question I want to get to, and I want to make sure I get it right, so I am going to grab my notes, is a quote that I saw on your website, and that is, editorial workflows are radically changing at the moment, and there is a huge need for small, flexible houses. So two-part question. What is the radical change, and how does Dirty Robber fill that need?
So all industries are dependent upon the technology that allows you to do your industry, right? Like the car industry radically changed when we switched from steam engines and electric engines in like the 1905s to gasoline, and we're changing again to hybrids. The film industry is very dependent on digital technology, and right now we're going through a moment where we're switching from editorial being something where the equipment costs lots of money to something where the equipment is available to everybody. So for instance, in the 90s, it used to cost $1,000 a day just to get on an Avid, right? Whereas today, you can set up a whole Avid editing system or a Final Cut Pro editing system, let's be honest, for like $3,000 in your bedroom. Yeah, $2,000 iMac and $1,000 for the thing. So the tool is no longer the thing that's standing in the way. So we're changing from a universe where what's scarce is the tool to a universe where what's scarce is the skill. And because of that, the marketplace is radically changing. All of a sudden, it used to be that the only way to get a job as an editor is, to work your way up from the bottom, and then if your grandfather was an editor, it certainly helped. And nowadays, anybody has the tool at their disposal, so anybody can sit in the room and figure out how to use it and get really good at it, and if they're good enough at it, then they're in equal competition with everybody else.
So the post-production process, which was a huge fundraising obstacle maybe to the indie filmmaker, something that they had a plan for, now all of a sudden becomes much more affordable, and you can work with filmmakers that maybe 5-10 years ago wouldn't have been able to afford the things that you do because you can get the equipment cheaper, so then you can turn around and offer it at a more affordable price to the consumer. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. Specifically talking about color grading, as recently as 5 years ago, you couldn't color grade HD footage realistically for less than $1,700 an hour. That was catalog rate for most of the places in town to do, well, the high-end places you could probably get a little bit less, but that was how much it went for. And the reason why is it took a $4 million machine to color grade, you had to have a Da Vinci and a Da Vinci 2K Resolve, and you had to have a Spirit coming off the film, so you had to have a lot of equipment and infrastructure in order to color grade. Now, our equipment costs us $100,000 to build the color room because you have to have broadcast monitors and color correct lights and stuff like that. But if it's $100,000, we don't have to bill $1,700 an hour anymore to pay it off. We can bill $400 an hour, and we can do like a block fee for an indie feature where we do a whole indie feature for like 10 grand, whereas previously color grading an indie feature, you couldn't get that in for less than like 50 or 60 grand. And our company, one of the reasons we started actually is that I and my partner and then another friend of ours had all been making these indie features, and we'd managed to scrape together, a buddy of mine did a whole movie for $60,000, and then he had to spend $20,000 color grading it. And he was like, but how come that part of the workflow is still so expensive? And so we researched it and we realized that there were options available for making that part of the workflow not as expensive as it used to be.
And how many films have you color graded?
I personally have color graded about a dozen films, probably 100 music videos and commercials, I mean, so like a dozen feature films and, I don't know, 50 so shorts at this point, so.
Well, let's take a look. I know we have a clip of some of your work that we brought with us. Let's take a look at that, and then maybe you can tell us what you did specifically after we come out.
Great.
Great. I want to get to my first instant message of the interview from a viewer, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question on what we just saw.
Fantastic.
Film Newbie 15, how does color correction work? Do you color one frame at a time, or can you pick a color for a scene and do the whole scene at one time?
You end up doing it one shot at a time, because when you shoot a film, ideally all of your shots sort of match, but realistically in production, and this is nobody's fault, this isn't a failure on the cinematographer's fault, there's going to be varieties in every shot. You're going to shoot one shot one, say, 1 hour, and then an hour later the sun's going to move, or you're going to shoot one shot this way and then another shot this way, and there's going to be these little imbalances through the whole thing, which is just a natural part of production. So it just tends to work much better to color grade each shot individually. What we can do is we can set a look for the opening shot of a scene. We can pick a scene and make it look exactly like what we want it to look like, and then we can take that correction to all the other shots in the scene and tweak them one at a time. But you wouldn't want to blanket put the same correction on the whole scene, because then you're not compensating for the natural sort of occurrences of production.
Yeah, one specific scene that you were working on for my project, when the coverage was one direction, that required one sequences of changes, and when the same scene, but when the coverage turned around, different set of fixes, if you will.
Exactly.
Now, you have answered my next question, because you were talking about a certain degree of color correction is going to be a natural part of the production process because of everything you just mentioned. Was there anything we saw in your demo there, or in general, that's not a natural part of production that could have been prevented by the cinematographer or the way it was shot on set? Does my question make sense?
Your question does make sense. What's interesting is it's changing the way we think about what you mean by that, right? Like, if a cinematographer from the 70s were to all of a sudden start working today, there'd be a lot of things they would naturally do in camera because they didn't have all the tools available. Like, digital color correction only came on in the 80s. So if you wanted to put a gentle vignette on something, if you wanted to have a little shadow in the corner, which I can do in seconds digitally, you had to do that in camera. So from the standards of that time, there's a lot of things that the cinematographers don't do today that they would have done then. However, from the standards of production now, since it's so easy to do it in post and so fast, and it's so important to move fast on set, you know, if you're wasting 5 or 10 minutes picking out the right vignette filter when we can just do it in post, it's better to try and get that extra shot you get with that extra 5 or 10 minutes. So no, when I look at that footage, there's nothing where I think to myself, oh, the cinematographer really shouldn't have done that. It's all the cinematographer delivering exactly what they intended to deliver as best they possibly could to give us all that room to manipulate it later in post. I'm trying to think if there are any exceptions in that footage, but I don't think so. I think that's exactly what we were looking for.
You alluded to it a little bit a minute ago, talking about high definition.
Yeah.
High definition versus standard definition, is it a more costly today still to do high def versus standard?
No, we charge about the same for standard def versus high def.
And then the other question about that is, you alluded to me when I met with you, because my product is in standard def. Why would you do that? There's so many more options in HD versus standard. Can you spell out a little bit of what you meant by that?
Well, most modern HD cameras, and I'm not talking about the low end here, on a $300 camera, it's standard def and HD is sort of meaningless. But if you're talking about like a $5,000 camera, which the XL1, which you shot on, XL2 was sort of around that. Well, it was like $3,000 when it came out. But like versus the HVX, it works in a bigger color space. And the way to think about that is it's like having more letters in your alphabet. So for instance, you could have like standard def just had a smaller alphabet of colors that it can choose from. And there's certain, like let's say your alphabet had T, I, M, and E in it. Certain words like Tim and time and TI are going to look great. But then certain other words like Heather are just not gonna,
Right.
you're gonna get an E and a T. And so the same thing with HD, you're moving up to a bigger color space, so you've got more letters in your alphabet that you get to play with. So all of a sudden you can have words like sunshine that you couldn't have in the smaller alphabet. So HD cameras, the big benefit more than resolution, because if you're finishing for the web, they're going to see it at about standard def anyway. But with an HD camera, you get this bigger color space. So they're capturing more of the information that's available on set, which means when we take it into post and we start to push it one way or the other, we have more room to play with it.
At least I can spell Timmy. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, you've got Timmy.
So another thing you said to me, see now, I was taking notes. You were coloring my project, but I'm like, what would be good questions for me to ask in my interview with you? You talked about colorists that come from a background of being a DP and colorists that come from a background of being an editor or maybe post-production. And they're being implying that there was a difference between the two.
There's something of a difference. There are great colorists who were never DPs. But in my experience of having worked with colorists back when I was a DP and then hiring colorists now, the colorists I tend to like to work with were originally DPs or at least have some DP experience. And I think that what that gives you is that gives you an appreciation of what happens on set. So if one shot's like a third of a stop above another shot, I never give a DP a hard time about it because, you're moving really quickly on set. And I think sometimes post guys don't understand the complications that happen on set. And I also think that when I found color grading as a profession, I was so excited because I'd been shooting and shooting and shooting, and I'd always wanted to be able to make my footage look like this. And all of a sudden, I had the tool to do the things that I'd been trying to do on set and couldn't. And I feel like there's a certain amount where it's just exciting if you haven't had the language to use something to get to use the words you've wanted to use, to use another language analogy. And I think cinematographers who become colorists have a tendency to, just be willing to go further with it. That being said, one of my favorite colorists just started as a colorist. So it's not a be-all, end-all, but there's a certain amount of, cinematographers spend their time training and making images look good.
Do you normally work alone? Do you normally work with the director and the DP, or what's optimal?
It depends upon the job. The more clients in the room, the slower it will go. Because all of a sudden, instead of just having to satisfy one client, you've got to satisfy 2 or 3 or 4. So things go slower. We bill by the hour, so I'm really comfortable going longer.
Right.
But it can slow things down, and it can also sometimes, people can find themselves, when they become so aware of everything they can do, walking away totally unsatisfied with anything they get. So there are certain jobs I do where I'm just up front with the director, and I'm like, for your budget, it's going to be better if you and I spend an hour together, and you leave and come back. And I just deliver it to you, and they walk away totally happy. There are other directors that need to tweak every shot. But what happens with that is sometimes if you have a really hard deadline and you end up tweaking every shot galore, it can, things can sprawl out. I mean, Tony Scott spends 3 or 4 months color grading a movie. And so if you don't have that in your budget, sometimes it's not worth it. I spent 8 hours once color grading a 30-second commercial. It was a blast, and the director was a super cool guy, but the trade-off is always time.
See, our thing went very fast working with you, and basically I just felt it was important to tell you what the creative intention was behind each scene, and then let you do your thing.
Yep.
Because I don't have the knowledge to micromanage, what you're doing, because you know what you're doing, obviously, a zillion times better. But I just felt, let you know what the creative intention. And one of my first questions sitting next to you, would you color this scene differently if I told you it was a drama versus a comedy?
Yeah. And that's a really good question, because those traditionally do have different moods. Obviously, my favorite comedy of all time, Annie Hall, looks more like a drama than a comedy. But traditionally, you do drama and comedy a little differently. It does affect the image, if you're doing it right, should affect the emotional content of the scene, so you would want to grade it slightly differently.
And then even within the context of it being a comedy, each individual scene has its own intention, and I wanted to kind of let you know that, and that did affect what you did. And,
definitely, because you're taking the audience on a journey. There's a phenomenon called color extension, which is if you look at one color for a long period of time, you tune it out. It's the same thing that happens if you walk into a room with like warm orange lights, you stop seeing the orange. And it's our brain's way of dealing with reality. It's the reason why, daylight's much bluer than tungsten light, but we don't notice. And the same thing happens in a movie theater. If I watch a 20-minute movie and it's all red the whole time, I forget that it's red. It's gone. And so that can be really powerful. If you want your final scene to be really blue, you can get rid of all the blue for 20 minutes and then have a really blue final scene, and it'll be extra blue because of how long it's been since you've seen blue and the way your body reacts to that. So it's important to know, oh, well, this scene is this moment and this scene is this moment, so that we can take them on a journey with color the way you take them on a journey with your story.
That's interesting. I'm so glad you answered that question that way, because you just reminded me of a color epiphany I had a few years ago, and I hope Brian doesn't mind me going off on this tangent a little bit. And that is how you get so used to seeing certain actors and actresses in certain sitcoms, and I'm like, maybe it's a little bit of typecasting, but it's also because, just to use two shows I used to watch, Seinfeld and Friends. Seinfeld is a green world. Friends is a red world.
Yep.
And when you see someone from the green world out of that world into a different color and light scheme, it's just not the typecasting of the character you're used to seeing them play, but you're so used to seeing them in a color world for so long that when you see them in another spectrum, it throws you off a little bit.
Yep, it's a total emotional connection you make to the palette that they live in.
Yeah. Plantar22 would like to ask, when do you normally get involved in working on a film? So you kind of...
So I'll say that normally I get hired about an hour before the project has to deliver, but ideally I get involved in pre-production. So frequently, I would say like half my jobs have to deliver in 3 days, and can we color grade a whole feature in 3 days because I've got to get it in because I'm screening at a festival. And we accommodate that. We are a freelance business, so we do what we can. But ideally, we like to get involved a little earlier in editorial, so we can plan out a workflow, plan out some dates, really shape it the way so that everybody can be there and everybody can get the most of it.
I think we were talking before we came on, and you mentioned an example of Aviator, I think it was?
Oh yeah, and then the example of the Aviator is the ideal example, which we're doing something similar on a film right now, which is you get involved in pre-production. Which means that if you know what look you want to go for, on the Aviator they wanted to mimic historical 2-strip and 3-strip color processes like Metrocolor and early Technicolor. And so they got involved in pre-production, shooting tests and color grading those tests so that they would know precisely, and they actually built a lookup table of exactly what they wanted the movie to look like in pre-production, and that affected their decisions on set. It affected Robbie Richardson's lighting, it affected the production design, it affected everything, because they knew exactly what they were going for the whole workflow. And so we're doing something similar like that right now with a filmmaker friend of mine. We're going to do some tests and help him settle on all aspects of what he's doing, because he knows from the beginning exactly what he wants to look like. That being said, if you don't 100% know exactly what you want to look like, it is more typical for us to get hired midway through the post-production process.
But if you do know what you want it to look like, so then, for example, that might affect what camera you might recommend someone use if you know what kind of color they want. And explain how that works.
Well, different cameras capture in different color spaces. So depending upon the ideal look you're going for, one camera or another might be better. For instance, if you come to us and you really want it to look like There Will Be Blood or Lawrence of Arabia, it's going to be very hard for us to deliver that if you shoot on an HVX. The color space isn't big enough, the latitude isn't big enough, the technical capabilities of the camera aren't good enough. But if we can work together in pre-production, we can figure out some choices you might make that'll help you throughout your production workflow, settle on the right camera, figure out what's right for your budget.
So what would be a good camera if you wanted to shoot a film and look like There Would Be Blood?
I would shoot 35 anamorphic.
Okay.
That movie is such a classic. I mean, that movie didn't even color correct digitally. It color corrected photochemically. It is a old school photochemical print.
So now you mentioned the term latitude a minute ago.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what that is?
Well, latitude refers to how bright and how dark an area of the image can be captured and still retain information. So this is really important when you get into color grading, because a lot of times, those of you out there who shoot video, a lot of times you shoot video and then there's like a window in the background and it's all blown out in white, right? So we bring it into color grading and we try and darken that white down, but there's no information there, so it just turns gray. So there's just a weird, gross gray window in the back. Whereas cameras with wider latitude are capable of resolving detail outside that window and inside the room, or on a bright, sunny day outside the shadow and inside the shadow. And film obviously currently has the widest latitude of anything we're working with, but then there's digital formats like the Genesis and the Red that also have a very wide latitude. And those give us more room in color correction. They give us more freedom to play, because we can all of a sudden say, I want to bring that sky back, and I start darkening the sky, and details come out that you couldn't see before. They did a thing actually, they rescanned Wizard of Oz, and they discovered that a lot of the skies that we'd all been watching The Wizard of Oz for 50 years that had no clouds in them, the film had actually recorded clouds, we'd just never seen it. So it was a big decision to make as to whether or not they should go in and, when they did the new digital master, give clouds back that no audience had ever seen. And what they decided to do on that project was make it match an original 1938 print as best they could.
I got to put you on the spot for a second. So for There Will Be Blood, you said 35 millimeter. Okay,
Yeah.
but if you had to use a digital camera, throw out one recommendation.
Right now, the Red is the digital camera par excellence. The Red camera has some issues. It's not a perfect camera, but for the budget, there's nothing that can beat it.
And on your website, you have a special, first of all, on your website, you have a great 4-page PDF of how to prepare, your film for color work, but then you have a separate allocation for the Red camera specifically.
Yeah.
But what are some of the specific considerations for Red?
Well, the great thing about Red is it shoots to a raw codec, which means that much like shooting raw on your still camera, you're able to maintain a lot more of the information. A lot of that information doesn't get thrown out in compression. But you have to do a couple technical things, which are spelled out on our site, in order to make sure that you're color grading those raws. Because you can't actually edit raws. Final Cut won't work with natively raw. You have to work with a QuickTime file. So you make QuickTime files from your raws and you edit that. But when you're color grading, you really want to go back to your raw and get that full range of information. So that would be one sort of technical hiccup.
Now, I alluded to someone named Brian before. That would be Brian Gramo, the executive producer of the show, who is
that's me.
A tech genius over there. You want to chime in? You got any questions for us, Brian?
I'll chime in since you're bringing me up. First of all the viewers wanted to compliment you on the red soles of your shoe. That they can see. So points there. People really like that. They're like, he's a color guy. And hopefully he doesn't judge the color correction of this show too much. And this wouldn't be a good thing for Jeff to read because it's actually about Jeff. This is from Captain Jack Harkness, a longtime viewer watching live today. He says, I salute you all. I want to wish Jeff a happy birthday. He is the best.
Thank you very much, Captain Jack. You are a very valued supporter of this show and the Stream.tv and a great guy. I had the opportunity to meet you once when you came out here. I think it was a Hooters extravaganza after a particular episode.
Right. But getting back to color correction, actually I had Jeff go over the Latitude thing so much. When you're choosing a camera, the Latitude ends up being this huge thing, and like I never even thought to go into the color correction scheme of it. But like when you don't have that information there, a color artist can't move things around and separate the areas to bring those clouds back or to get those things darker. So that's huge when you're picking a camera. And so if you can get your hands on that Red, he's absolutely right. Get it.
Now, for multiple camera shoots, what is the importance of those two cameras being the same model? Is that a problem? Is it not a problem?
It's completely vital that the two cameras on a multicam show should be the same camera, unless you're deliberately going for a look in which you're mixing cameras and that's part of your aesthetic. For instance, on any given Sunday, they shot 9 different film stocks. So, mixing lenses and cameras, and they're going for that thing where you cut into an insert and it feels a little different and it gives you that shock effect. But if you're not going for that thing, if you want it to just be a normal conversational scene in a romantic comedy, it's very difficult to make 2 different cameras match. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult because the color science in the 2 cameras is inherently different. And the latitude in any 2 cameras is going to be different. It's hard to make 2 cameras from the same brand, model, and camera factory match. So it's even harder to make it match when it's 2 different models of camera with 2 different lenses, different contrast ratios in the glass. So I would really encourage you to make sure you're matching your cameras, and make sure before any shoot you go through all the menus in your camera, and you make sure all the menus in the camera are set up identically. And
so that way, even if you're using 2 of the same model, you still have to make sure that those menu items are set up the same. Otherwise,
Definitely.
in essence, it's almost like working with 2 different cameras.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I can give you guys a live demo right now because we unfortunately don't have all the same cameras here. So if you look into your single right now, that is a newer DVX BP, which has a better latitude. So the color, there's more color. And if you look at this shot right here, that's our older DVX. And as much as I can do with the color correction on the TriCaster, I can't get it exactly as rich as this shot, which is our better camera. So even though they're the same brand, you can actually see it right there. And we try to get it as close as possible. But I don't know, what would you do in that situation when you have something like this?
The unfortunate thing about this situation is usually you're satisfying the worst shot, right? Usually it's easier. It might not be possible to make the bad shot look like the good shot. And so it's often more important for it all to be consistent, or else the bad shot jumps out at the audience. So often the choice we make is we say, all right, which shot is the hardest one to correct? We make that look as good as we can, and then we bring everything else down to match it, which is always a shame when you're taking this great footage, but it's better to have everything, because we're telling stories. So it's not necessarily about how great it looks, it's about immersing the audience in the story. So if we have one shot that's just jumping out as being really bad, it's better to bring them all down to match it so that the audience can get into the story than it is to have that one camera you keep cutting to that doesn't work as well as the rest.
Fair enough. On that prep sheet, on prepping your work to bring it into you, one of the things mentioned on there is remove all filters.
Yes.
So what's a filter, and why is it important for the filmmaker to remove all of them before they bring the work to you?
So filters are something you can apply in Final Cut. There's a lot of aftermarket filters out there, Magic Bullet and Red Giant, to sort of mimic the action of color grading in Final Cut. You can also do a lot of other things with them. You can give like a night vision effect, or you can add some diffusion. You can do all of those things. A lot of those things we can also do in color. But what happens if you don't remove them in Final Cut is they don't show up in color. So when we do send to color and we bring it over to color, all of a sudden we're working in a program affecting the images. We make the images look exactly like you want them to. And then we send it back to Final Cut and those filters get reapplied. And then you render it out and it doesn't look at all like what we agreed in the color session. So it's really important to wipe the slate clean, bring it into the color session, and make it look like what you want in the color session. There are certain exceptions, but that tends to be the best way to work.
What is the challenge that slow motion or fast motion presents to you in color correction?
It's purely a technical thing with color. The way in which Final Cut and Final Cut Studio Color interact uses XML, which is a extensible markup language, and XML is not very good with slow-mo right now. So it's much easier to bake it out, create a new QuickTime, re-import that new QuickTime with the slow-mo baked in, and then bring that into color than it is to just leave the slow-mo on in the Final Cut sequence. It can with Final Cut Color 1, it caused render problems. With Final Cut 1.5, you don't get the render problems, but you can't use keyframes. And a lot of times I like to keyframe. Keyframes means changing your grade for different parts of the shot. And I really like to use that when working in color. So I prefer everything to be baked out. Additionally, most editors prefer to use the Final Cut slow motion tool isn't the most sophisticated, so a lot of editors prefer to use Twixtor, and then I think Red Giant has a slow-mo plugin that they like better. So usually they just end up using that to create their slow-mo in After Effects anyway.
So now, prior to Final Cut 7, I guess we're up to now, and color, was Vinci, was that the standard for most color work?
Well, and Vinci is still the standard for most color work, although there's companies like Assimilate Scratch and Baselight and Vinci that are sort of, but they're in what we call the real-time world. And color's going to get to the real-time world soon, we're just not there yet. And the real-time world is, while you work, the color grade is fully done. So you bring your project in, you do your grade, bam, it is finished. You are ready to leave. Whereas color works in a render-based world. So we can do all our changes and you can see it in real time, but then when we're done, remember you went to dinner and we did your render. On a feature film, a render can take 8 to 10 hours, which is better than it was when I did my first job in 1999. My feature render took a week. And that was, I left on vacation. And then I came back and the machine was still rendering 5 days later. But we're still in the render-based world. Whereas DaVinci, or those kind of systems, which run up into the hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, are doing real time. There's rumors going around about how quickly color is going to be able to move into real time, and that's certainly the direction color is heading. It's just not there yet.
How is the alphabet of color versus the alphabet of DaVinci?
So they both work in 888 color space.
Can they both spell sunshine?
They can both spell sunshine.
Okay, very cool. Drink Moxie would like to ask, how did you get started in color correcting? What should I be studying if I wanted to do your job?
Well, that's a really great question. I got started in color correcting. I was working as a cinematographer, and I met a guy who was starting a color grading company called Cinelicious, who was a great color grading company, and he said, I think you would be a really good colorist, which I thought was a really interesting thing to say. And so I started working with him and helped him build up his company, and learned how to be a colorist working at his company while he started it. And then eventually we split ways because he went down a very film-centric path, whereas I'm more of a video-centric path, although I still use him a lot when I have film transfers to do. And started my own company myself. So that's how I got my start. Right now, if you wanted to learn to be a colorist, Columbia College Hollywood, where I teach, I think is the only film school in LA with a full color grading class. But there's a lot of great resources out there for learning color grading. Steve Hullfish, Hullfish, has written a couple great books on color grading. And the Apple Pro Training Series books on color grading are both really phenomenal books to help you get your feet wet with color grading.
Well, let me ask you then, Professor, what do you say on the first day of classes to your color students about how long it'll take to master it and what to expect in the field and so forth?
I give the same speech to them that I give to my cinematography students, which is that color grading, like cinematography and like most of filmmaking, is the meeting of artistic ends and industrial means, right? So the unfortunate thing about both cinematography and color grading is there's a lot of technical information you have to get over the hurdle of, and you have to internalize to the point where you don't even think about it anymore. So like with cinematography, I can't remember not knowing what the f-stops were. Like, 2.84, 5.68, 11, I can't remember what it was like not to know those numbers. And you have to get to the point where you don't even think about those things.
And for those who don't know what the f-stops are?
The f-stops are the little numbers on the ring of the lens that tell you how big your aperture is. So color grading is much the same way. There's a hurdle of technical information you have to overcome in order to be able to interact with it without even thinking about it anymore. Once you get over that hurdle of technical information, like codecs and color spaces and workflows, and it's a 12-week class, and by the end of that 12-week class, you should have probably been able to internalize that basic information. From there, it all depends upon how quickly you really dive into it. We had one colorist come to start working for us who had never colored before, and within a month, she was color grading a feature because she had an artistic background and she'd color corrected photos before, and she really dove in. And then we have other people that take 6 months to gain the same amount of knowledge to be sort of a junior colorist and start on their own stuff.
Okay, I want to get to another website question, then I want to ask you about your favorite codec and why. So let's see what we have here on the IM board, if we can scroll that slightly up or down. Okay, Fram, is it safe to say the default Final Cut tools will always be beat out by third-party plugins if you can get your hands on them?
Not necessarily. The three-way color corrector in Final Cut is a very good tool, and it comes with Final Cut. And Final Cut's actually doing a pretty good job of just buying any plugin that they really like. So like they internalize Boris by buying Boris. So the great thing about the plugins is that they're able to they don't need a huge market to survive. They charge a certain fee and they're able to keep themselves in business, so they can make very specialized plugins for certain tools. For instance, Tim Dashwood is making the Dashwood Stereoscopic Cinema plugin, which at this point probably only has a few hundred customers, but it's worth it for him in a way that it's not really worth it for Apple to get involved in that. And then if he's lucky, Apple will buy Dashwood's plugin. But no, there's great Final Cut plugins built into the program. The aftermarket plugins tend to just be more aggressive in what they can do.
Okay, so I want to get back to that codec question. What's the one that you prefer to use, and what are the ones that you will use?
Gotcha. So right now we prefer to only work in Apple ProRes. Apple ProRes is a codec that Apple released with Final Cut Studio 6 and 7, and it's what we call very processor friendly or processor native, which means you can run it on an Intel Apple processor and it runs really efficiently. So for instance, off the RAID set at our office, we can run 2 or 3 streams of full 1080p ProRes, and the computer can run them just fine with no jittery slowdown. There's other codecs out there. There's uncompressed. A lot of clients, especially when they're new, want everything to be uncompressed because they hear uncompressed and they think that's great. Wouldn't you want it to be uncompressed? The thing is even uncompressed as a codec has some compression built into it, and uncompressed is not processor native, which means that when you're editing uncompressed, even standard def uncompressed can be too processor intensive, and you won't even be able to play back in real time. So if it's the trade-off between being able to edit in real time and like watch your clips play back, or not being able to watch your clips play back, and there's no visual difference between the two, it just makes sense to go ProRes every time.
Okay. Also, I think there's something on the prep page about not bringing it in a full QuickTime or .mov file.
Well, a lot of beginning clients think, oh, well, I'll just export you a complete QuickTime MOV and you'll color grade that. The problem is, as we talked about earlier, you're going to want different grades on different shots. You're going to have some shots a little brighter, some shots that are a little darker. And so if you do that, we have to bring in that QuickTime and we have to add edits on all of those shots so that we can do different grades. So it's much easier for us if you bring us a Final Cut Pro sequence. So all of your edits are there and all the dissolves are there. Because let's say you're dissolving from day to night. Well, we might do very different color grades on either side of that. But it's very hard to do that if you've already baked them together into a Final Cut, into a QuickTime file.
And the bottom line on a lot of these things we're talking about is you can do the work one way or the other, but it's a matter of faster, more efficient, more effective, and saving the client money.
Exactly. We try and do everything we can to keep the budget down. We have no interest in charging for anything that the client could do themselves quite easily. So if you're a Final Cut Pro savvy client, we are interested in working with you to make sure that you do as much as you possibly can so that when you bring it to us, all we do is the stuff we're expert at. We're willing to do prep. You can give us a Final Cut Pro project and we will get it ready for color grading, but we don't charge, we charge almost what we do to do that, to do color grading, and so if we could save the client that cost, we would rather.
So another cost-saving tip would be to break the project up into 5 to 10-minute reels?
Well, it depends. That's left over from Color 1. With Color 2, Color 1.5, which we're working with now, we tend to work with longer reels, somewhere in the 15 to 20-minute range. But yeah.
And the purpose behind that is?
Color crashes a lot if you send it too long a project. So if you send it like a hour-and-a-half long project, it just makes color crash more often.
Right. You were saying in general there are a lot of things that could make color crash and that you're hopeful that when the next version comes out.
Well, currently we're at 1.5.1, and it's much stabler than it was at Color 1, and I've been very happy with it, and it crashes no more often than Final Cut crashes, so it's about equivalent to that. And you know, there's hope for Final Cut 2, and I mean Color 2 and some of the things in there, but I'm happy with where Final Cut 1.5.1 is right now.
So what percentage of being a colorist would you say is technical versus creative?
I would say 30% is technical and 70% is creative. The frustrating thing is you don't get to do the 70% that's creative until you have the 30% that's technical mastered. But most of my job is talking to clients about, well, does that look good? Does that not look good? And why? And most of it's trying to get from my clients what they would like their movie to look like. You know, when they close their eyes, when they picture their footage, what they want it to be. But I have to have that 30% of technical totally integrated to the point where I don't even think about it anymore to get to do that fun stuff.
What are some of the more challenging scenes for you to correct? Too dark, too light, too
Well,
blue, too?
Either one tend to be very difficult. Anytime it's, you know, what I tell DPs when we only have a 10-minute meeting is just give me a big fat waveform. And I can do anything with a big fat waveform. So if it's really too dark and your waveform's all the way down there in the bottom and everything is really dark, or it's really too bright, there's not a lot I can do. I can do little things, but I can't go super far. One of the biggest difficulties I have is if you're mixing formats and exposure. So if you've got shots that are shot on a TVX and shots on an HVX and shots on a red and you want them to look all the same and the exposure is all over the map, that's when we start really getting into it, because as you exchange exposure, graininess changes and contrast changes and saturation changes. So every shot has to get massaged to sort of bring it into this one world. The other biggest, most difficult thing to correct for is clients who are unable to agree as a group on what they want. And that's been it's very difficult because, you know, usually it's a conversation between me and one client, but if there's 4 clients in the room and they want different things, it becomes a battle between them that I'm trying to diplomatically not take a side in.
Right.
But of course I'm going to have opinions about what looks better.
Right.
And so I try and let them figure out who they consider the boss to be and then work primarily with them.
Well, let's see, I'm going to test your memory now, because in my short, I felt like I had one scene that was too dark and one scene that was a little bit on the blown out side. But your response to the scene that I thought was blown out was like, yeah, I've seen much worse.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall that. So talk about my scene that was kind of on the too light side, and do you remember that the evening scene that was too dark where I wanted you to kind of level it all out? Can you talk about those?
Your evening scene that was too dark was really dark. And trying to brighten that up at all, it got really noisy. When you try and brighten up video footage, you get a lot of grain or noise in the image. So that was a really difficult one because we wanted to brighten it up a little bit. So what I did on that, to get technical, is I raised the midtones, which means I took the middle part of the color spectrum and I brightened that up, and then I darkened the shadows. Because if I raised the midtones and I didn't darken the shadows, the image would get really noisy. So even though the image was already too dark, I was brightening part of it and darkening the other part of it to keep the contrast and keep it looking nice. The area that was too bright was...
Wait, just a second. Customer was very happy with the work you did on that scene, by the way.
Great, I'm really glad to hear it.
So now switch to talk about the white.
The scene that was too bright wasn't that particularly bright. It was a day exterior, and what always happens with day exteriors is you have to let the sky go. The flip side is you light your actors to be as bright as the sky, but you clearly didn't have that budget, and most people don't. Or you bring in a giant silk to, you know, bring down the light and even it out. But all of these tools are really expensive. So if you're a low-budget indie filmmaker, usually the choice you make is, I'm just going to let the sky go. So I get lots of footage in where the sky is gone, and it's totally part of, I mean, for instance, when we were looking, I don't know why I'm pointing at that monitor, there's one over here. When we were looking at the sizzle reel, and there were all those Intel spots, the green grass and the blue sky, they let the sky go on those, and those are Intel ads, and they let the sky go, and we added the blue sky in post.
Now let me ask you this question. When you fixed that scene a little bit, and I asked you, can you do a little more with it? And you said, no, we really shouldn't, because then X, Y, Z happens.
Yeah.
And I defer to your expertise. Do you deal with filmmakers that say, oh, I don't care, because they have it in their mind that it just can't be you know, that white looking?
You deal with that all the time. That's totally part of it, and I'm happy to go show it, you know? In that particular case, we really couldn't have gone that much further. It just would have turned gray. And you know, I'm happy to go down roads that I don't think are necessarily the best, but I usually give the warning and I say, like, you've hired me for my expertise, you've hired me for my reel, and looking at this shot, this is how far I think you can take it. But I'm always happy to demonstrate that you can't go further.
The Fleet Admiral has a question.
I'm really digging Charles here. Hey, first of all, I commend you for the fact that not only does this guy have to be a color correction expert, he's got to be a customer service person too. I mean, and that part's just awful. So I commend you. Charles, can you say something to this person for me? This is the guy I want you to say something to, because it happens all the time and it kind of annoys me. It's that guy that wants to make it look really cool, or he wants to make it look like Saving Private Ryan or something, and his idea is like, well, I'll just shoot it in the wrong color temperature so it looks all blue. Can you talk to that guy for me and tell him no?
Please don't. Please, please don't. Here's the thing. When I was a DP, if I knew that I wasn't going to get to be involved in the color grading process, I would try and dial in settings in the like the Saving Private Ryan look is a very contrasty, very blue look, right?
And achieved in a very complicated way.
The technical specifications for, because they didn't even skip bleach the negative on that. They skip bleached the print on that, which is incredibly expensive, increases your shipping costs to the theaters. It's a complicated process, what they did on Saving Private Ryan. Creating that with a DVX is really hard and better done in post. But if there were certain jobs when I was a DP where I knew that the producer was like shady and wouldn't want me in post or whatever, or I knew I was shooting something that was going to be edited in another country or whatever, where I would try and dial it in a little closer in camera. And I encourage my cinematography students to do that, because fundamentally your cinematographers get hired and fired on dailies, which is unfair, because good cinematographers know that they're going to get color graded. But if the producer walks in and the dailies don't look like what they thought they were going to look like, it can really hurt the cinematographer, even though the cinematographer was deliberately shooting it really flat for the post grade. So I would say that, yeah, Brian, I agree with you. You shouldn't always do that to your cameras. You shouldn't always shoot outside in daylight while your camera's tungsten balanced to get that crazy blue look, because it's not always going to look very good. It would look better if you did it with the 3-way color corrector in Final Cut if you're editing in Final Cut. But I also understand the instinct, so it's a trade-off.
Now, another thing you said to me that I'm assuming you say to every client within 5 minutes of starting a session, and that is that what you're going to see on my monitor is the best your project's ever going to look, because your monitor is calibrated a certain way.
Yep.
So what is that way that your monitor is calibrated, and why aren't other monitors calibrated that way?
All right, so my monitor is calibrated to something called Rec 709, which is the recommendation from the SMPTE, the group of Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. That's the standard of what a TV should look like, SMPTE Rec 709. So I calibrate my broadcast monitor to that, and I can make it look amazing in my color grading suite. What happens is every TV manufacturer has access to Rec 709, and what they should do, Rec 709 is for HD, Rec 601 is for standard def. What they should do is make their TVs match Rec 709. But if they did that, you would go into Best Buy and you would look at a wall of TVs, and the picture in every one would look exactly the same. And so TV manufacturers don't do that. TV manufacturers deliberately, in the factory, mess with their controls. Some people think it looks better cooler with blue colors. Some people think it looks too better orange. Some people think it looks too better brighter. Some people think it looks better contrastier. So they do that, and that's why when you go into Best Buy and you look at the wall of TVs, they all look different. And so it's very frustrating for a filmmaker. I mean, this frustration is what led George Lucas to create THX, which is a set of theatrical standards for projection, so that projection would always be the same. And THX actually has home theater standards, so that home theater is always the same, because he was driven nuts when he was watching Star Wars at how the volume was different in every theater he went to, because the projectionist was setting the volume. So it's that same kind of phenomenon where we make these things and we get to see it one time in the color grading suite, and it just looks great. And then we watch it on the web, and who knows how the monitor you're watching it at, you're watching on a laptop or an iPhone in sunshine, and it will never look that good again.
So speaking of monitors and different TVs then, do you color differently? Do you make different recommendations in pre-production based on a project that you know is going to land on the net versus DVD versus the theater?
I don't make different, well, theater versus television we do, definitely. But it more happens after we color grade. We color grade for Rec 709. And then if you're releasing to the web, we'll specifically encode it for web gamma, because the web uses a different gamma, or Macintosh on the web uses a different gamma than normal television. So we'll encode it for that. And we'll make specific encodes for different platforms that compensate for the different benefits of all of the platforms. Yeah.
I may have to bring my project back to you. Brian, what do you got for me?
He kind of answered. That there, but in that, I wanted him to address specifically a lot of things people ask all the time is a filmmaker or someone that with a lower budget will make something, and yes, it'll look completely different on all of these different mediums. It looks one way on this TV and one way on that TV. And yes, you can specifically encode things for different mediums, but sometimes the same file you look at looks fine on this. Like when you have yours, it looks different on all monitors, but if I want to go watch Lost or I want to go watch House, for some reason it doesn't matter what monitor I watch that same file on, it always looks good. So how are they doing that? Even if I'm looking at the same master file, where my master file on the web looks different on every monitor.
Well, that's a fantastic question. There's one thing I know they do, and then there's probably some magic that they don't even tell me about. But the one thing I know they do is those web players use JavaScript to know what they're being played on. So they can sense, am I on a Mac, am I on a PC? They can sense the operating system of the PC, and they can sense what browser they're in, because different browsers have different ways of dealing with the Flash plugin. So that is how they do it, is they can tell what they're being shown in, and they accommodate their settings based on what format they're being shown on. There's probably something more sophisticated than that is secret magic lost sauce that I don't get to know about, but that's my understanding.
I think you kind of answered this a little while ago, but I see it on the board there, so I will ask it from Dark Side of the Force. Is color correction like makeup? You can look good without it, but you'll always look better with it. A little bit of a sense of humor there, I think. Pretty much every project, because of production, is going to need color work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because every movie, I'm trying to think of exceptions to this. Every movie going back to the beginning of history, we've been manipulating the image in post. Color grading used to be called color timing because in the beginning you would sit there with a stopwatch and time how long it was in the bath to manipulate exposure and contrast and things like that. And different cinematographers worked with different labs to create their own special processing recipes. So I think that's kind of a good cheeky answer, and I like it as a cheeky answer, but I think it's, all right, let's put it like this. It depends upon the marketplace you're competing in. So for instance, I wouldn't go to if I were a model, which I'm not, but if I were a model, I probably wouldn't go to a model casting call without makeup.
Right.
And since we're competing in a marketplace where everyone else is color grading, I feel like you owe it to yourself to color grade your footage and bring it up to the same level of everyone else's so that you're competing on the same platform. Because it subconsciously affects the way in which we feel like it subconsciously affects our sensation of quality, right? When I see something that has been really well color graded, I think the performances look slightly better, the music sounds slightly better. It's that funny thing where when the images are better, it just feels more professional. So if we have two films that are totally equal and one has a really great grade on it, I think that one's going to get the bigger audience, book that person more jobs.
Well, interesting thing is I sought out a colorist specifically for two scenes.
Yeah.
But then all the other scenes look better too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Scenes
Exactly.
that when I was watching it, it didn't concern me. So it wound up being a good thing for the entire process. You've got a class this fall that I alluded to in the introduction where you're teaching stereoscopic. What is that about?
So stereoscopic is two-camera 3D shooting. So one of the things that's fun about teaching is I get to sort of stay on the cutting edge. We were the first school to have a color grading course, and now we're the first school to regularly offer a stereoscopic cinema course, which is really fantastic. And we have a two-camera 3D mirror rig, similar to what they use to shoot Avatar or parts of Avatar. And similar to what they use on My Bloody Valentine 3D and all of those things. And we go out every week and we shoot two-camera stereoscopic stuff with the students and give, I like to think that what I do at Columbia and at all the film schools where I teach is help give students the skills to get them jobs where jobs are gonna happen, as opposed to where jobs have been happening. So like color grading, I think, is going to be a huge growth industry, and I think stereoscopic cinema is going to be a huge growth industry. So I think those two things are really helpful. And color grading stereoscopic, there's twice as many shots to grade. So
fair enough. Well, the question we like to get people out of here on is, do you have a favorite set speak term?
Favorite set speak term? Yes, it is woof. I like the term woof. And woof is what you say on set when you want someone to stop doing something. So if you're like, bring in that flag, bring it, yeah, and woof. And the reason why you say woof, apparently, is because if you say stop, the ACs get confused. They hear the word stop and they're like, stop, Stop. Do I have to set the f-stop? Now, I've never had, when I accidentally say stop, my ACs never get flustered. But apparently for their benefit, we say woof, and that is my favorite.
Well, I always like it when about 110, 112, I'm losing track of how many episodes we've done over here, 113, when we get a new, never before uttered favorite set speak term. So woof to you.
We use that here, Jeff, and like when new guys start working here, they're like, "What are you saying?" And I'm just like, I don't know. That's what they say. So if I'm having Jared pan, he'll keep panning, and I'll say woof. And I heard it from a DP because of the same reason. So that's cool. You're the first person that said that.
Very cool. And the website for Dirty Robber is?
DirtyRobber.com.
And any other projects you're working on right now you want to plug before we let you get out of here?
What can I plug right now? March 15th, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Dawn of the Dreadful will go online, so everybody be on the lookout. March 15th, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, Dawn of the Dreadfuls.
And that was DirtyRobber.com.
DirtyRobber.com.
Fantastic. Charles Haine, thanks so much for coming in, and thanks again for working on my project.
It was a pleasure on both counts. It's been a fun time.
Great, glad you liked it. That is going to do it for this Monday, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time edition of Filmnut. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the show.